From the book of Luke, starting in chapter 22, verse 63. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. When the day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council, and they said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." So they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ. He is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all of Judea, from Galilee even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some signs done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who has been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with their loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will.
There's a scene in the movie Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. I don't know where I'd get most of my material if I didn't know about that movie, but there's a scene in that movie, if you've seen it, where the two characters, one's played by John Candy, the other's played by Steve Martin, and they're in a car, and they pull onto the interstate, but they're going the wrong direction. Like, if all the traffic on the interstate's going this direction, they pull on in some odd way, and they're going this direction. So on the other side of the median, on the other side of the interstate, another car pulls up, drives at their speed, rolls down the window, and screams at them, "You're going the wrong way." Dell, this is John Candy's character, is driving the car, and he said, "Oh, he's just drunk. How do they know where we're going?" Steve Martin's character thinks about that for a second. Yeah. How would they know where we're going? And they just keep going and moving along. Completely dismiss the warning, think that those people screaming at them were crazy, until two semis side by side ripped the sides of their car off, going the other direction. They completely missed the solution to the problem, which was to stop going the wrong way, turn around, go the right way, because they didn't actually understand the problem. And with somebody screaming at them, they still just didn't understand the problem. Something similar happens with the gospel. The gospel is a solution. The gospel is actually the solution to our biggest, most urgent problem that we have as people, every single one of us. The gospel is a solution. But to understand the solution, you have to understand the problem. That's where we struggle today. We really do. We struggle to conceptualize and to understand what our biggest problem is, so that the gospel oftentimes gets confused as the solution. So what's our biggest problem as people? This is one of the things that we're going to look at as we walk through this passage that Ruth just read. If you haven't turned with me to Luke 22, go ahead and turn with me. There should be Bibles in the chairs if you need one. We're going to talk about all these passages. We're going to read various passages and kind of hop around a little bit to understand Luke's message here. One of the things about Luke's gospel compared to the other three gospel authors, Matthew, Mark, and John, is that Luke is using these situations, the arrest, I would even back it up and say the Passover meal, but the arrest, the trial, the execution of Jesus, he's using these passages to emphasize two things, two incredibly important things. One of those two things is how absolutely innocent Jesus is. The other thing is how absolutely guilty everybody else in the narrative is. How innocent Jesus is and how guilty everybody else is. So let's take some time, because much of this is dedicated to how guilty everybody else is. Let's talk about the guilt of these human actors in this narrative here. And again, I'm going to back us up a little bit into even the Passover meal, the Last Supper that Jesus spends with his disciples. First of all, we have Judas. So if you go back up in the text a little bit to chapter 22, verses 21 and 22, during the Last Supper, we have Judas, and Jesus refers to him at that point without a name. He just says, one of you, one of my disciples, apostles, one of you is going to betray me. And we know that is Judas. In fact, in chapter 22, verses 47 and 48, it is Judas, and he does betray Jesus with a kiss. Look at 47 and 48. While Jesus was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. But he drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" And the other Gospels record that he did indeed betray Jesus with a kiss. So we have Judas, but it's important to see that even in the Passover meal, Judas is not the only one in sin. He's not the only guilty person here. You have the other 11 disciples. Because remember what they did when Jesus signaled that one person in that room was going to betray him? They immediately started arguing about, well, which one of us is the greatest? Which one of us is going to get to sit on your right side or your left side when you enter your glory? Look at chapter 22, verse 24. A dispute also arose among them as to which one of them was to be regarded as the greatest. I'm guessing most of you don't turkey hunt, probably, and that's okay. Let me tell you something odd about turkey hunting. If you shoot a turkey and there are other male birds there, oftentimes, and I would say more times than not, the other male birds next to the turkey that you just shot will start to jump on that turkey and peck at it and beat it up because the opportunity arose. There's a dead turkey there or a dying turkey there, and it's their chance to establish themselves as above on the pecking order, and it's quite a humorous thing. That's what I see when we read about these other disciples. When Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me, one of you is going to go down, one of you is going to fail morally, and all the others who they're not considering that. So I would say it's safe to say they know it's not them. They start arguing about which one of them is now going to be the greatest. And that's evidence of their guilt. That's evidence of their sin. They just don't get it. Jesus is right there. He's modeled humility for them. He's modeled the kingdom for them. They are running the opposite direction from the kingdom in that moment. Shortly after this, Jesus is arrested. It's at that point that Peter denies Jesus. We talked about that. Denies him 3 times in public. Then we move on and we see that all of the Jewish leaders are guilty. All of them. And one of the things that Luke does here is he mentions every category of Jewish leader. All the different possible sects and leaders. He mentions the Pharisees, the scribes, the priests. All of these religious leaders are also guilty. They conspired with Judas to betray Jesus at night in order to save their skin, knowing that the crowds would push back and resist them, possibly even threaten their own lives if it was during the day. So they arrest Jesus at night on trumped-up charges. There's no basis for the arrest of Jesus, for what they did. And all these Jewish leaders know this, by the way. They're offended by Jesus. They don't like Jesus. They think that he's blaspheming. Jesus points this out to him. He's like, if I was truly guilty, you would have arrested me during the day. I gave you every possible opportunity to do that. Look at 22 verses 52 and 53. Jesus says to him, it says, then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and a club? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. It's not enough to only arrest Jesus. Luke wants us to truly see the guilt and the sin of these people, because between the time when they arrest Jesus and the next day when there's kind of this fake court over fake charges, the people in this arresting party that are tasked with watching Jesus throughout the night, they have fun with him throughout the night. They make fun of him, they beat him up, they mock him. Look at what it says in 63 through 65. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. In verses 66 through 71, we have this mockery of a trial between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. And again, it's all kinds of leaders. It's the elders, the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, people that lead the temple. They ask Jesus, are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah? And Jesus says to them, this is in verse 67, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And then they ask him the question, "Are you the Son of God?" And his answer to this is also interesting. It says in verse 70, "And he said to them, 'You say that I am.'" You say that I am. What do you do with that answer? That's like, I was joking around with somebody in the foyer last week, in fact, and we were, joking about, I don't know, that's not the important part. Anyway, one of them said, "Well, you just think you're great, don't you, Zeke?" And I'm like, "Well, you said it, not me." That's very much like the statement Jesus makes when they say, "Are you the Christ?" He says, "You say that I am." There's not a flat-out denial of that, but there's also not a flat-out admittance of that or an agreement with that. Really what it does, it's a statement that puts the claim entirely back onto the person that just said it. It puts it in their court. Now, Luke wants us to see this because what is being illustrated over and over and over again in this text is how fully guilty these people are. Like they ask him, "Are you the Messiah? Are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus doesn't come back to them and give them any help in their process that they are carrying out. If these Jewish leaders decide to take Jesus before Pilate and ask Pilate to crucify him, as they will indeed do, it's going to be 100% on them. So it's a brilliant response. Jesus just says back to them, "You say that I am." Which again, they weren't actually asking him these questions to learn. They had made up their mind already. And they say, "Well, we've already heard enough. We've heard it all we've heard it for ourselves from his lips already." And so they plan to take him before Pilate. And that's what they do. And that's chapter 23, verses 1 through 16. See, these Jewish leaders, they didn't have the authority to actually carry out this death sentence, not in Rome. And so they're using Pilate, they're using Rome as something of a puppet executioner to get what they want. And Luke has been showing us what they want all throughout the gospel. He says over and over again, they wanted to put him to death. They want Jesus to die and be off the scene. And they're using Pilate, using Rome to accomplish what they want. And again, here's what Luke doesn't want us to miss, and that is that there is an incredible intentionality and cunning and collective strategizing. Like these different religious groups that oftentimes compete with each other, sometimes don't like each other, they came together and they put their best minds on the task of how do we get rid of Jesus? And it had to involve Rome. And Luke wants us to see their plan is actually brilliant. It is evil, but it is brilliant. They are going to paint Rome back into a corner where Rome has to give them what they want. Here's the fascinating part, one of the fascinating parts. Pilate is one of the most corrupt figures that we can read about from the ancient Middle East, from this period and this time. He's a corrupt figure. They bring Jesus before Pilate. Pilate investigates the matter, and then Pilate declares that Jesus is innocent. Look at verses 2 through 4 of chapter 23. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We've found this man misleading our nation." They're using all this language that's brilliant. It's perfect to get at Pilate. We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. They didn't want to give tribute to Caesar. And saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he gives the same kind of answer. He answered him saying, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching them throughout all Judea and Galilee, even to this place." So he says he's innocent, declares that Jesus is innocent. Now the crowds, the Jewish leaders, they don't like that, and they had another place to go. They came right back and said, "But he's stirring up the people. He's doing this not just here in Jerusalem, he's doing this from Galilee all the way to here." Pilate sees his out. Actually, he sees more than an out here to kind of get this off his plate. He sees a way to connect with somebody who had formerly, up to this point, been an enemy to him, Herod. Herod rules over the region around Galilee, and so Pilate can declare, hey, this should actually go to Herod. So he sends Jesus to Herod. And of course, Herod's happy about that, as we just heard, because it's like having a circus sent to you, right? He wants to see Jesus do amazing things, perform miracles. He wants to be entertained. And a new friend just sent him a person that could possibly entertain him. But here's another fascinating part of the narrative. Herod is absolutely one of the most corrupt people in this entire region at that time. And Herod investigates Jesus and finds him innocent. Look at chapter 23, verses 9 through 12. So Herod questioned him at some length, but Jesus made no answer. The chief priests and scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. The point that Luke is making could not be clearer. Everyone in this scene has blood on their hands. Everyone in this narrative is guilty, has sinned against God, has sinned against Jesus. Jesus is right here. He's right here. Doesn't matter. Jesus is different things to different people in this narrative. He's not God, but he's different things to different people. He's right there. One person, he was a chance to make 30 pieces of silver. For other people, for another group, he was an obstacle to their leadership. He was a chance for them to take action, get rid of him, and then restore your power and your reputation as the leaders of Israel. To others, he was entertainment. Maybe somebody that could just crank out miracles, kind of make the day go a little bit faster. He was a punching bag. For a couple guys, he was a chance to strike up a friendship where before was enmity. He's a lot of things to a lot of people. He's right there. He's present with them. Who cares? People got what they wanted. But the point is, in all that, you've got the one innocent, righteous, holy person who's ever walked this earth in their midst. And they're using him towards their means. Every single one of them is guilty. They all have blood on their hands. And guilty people run in a pack. The punctuation of this, perhaps the single best illustration of this, comes with the person Barabbas. A truly guilty person. And guilty in a way that everybody knew it. Like, we're not talking, steal a little change out of the jar by a register type of crime. Everybody knew that this man stirred up an insurrection, and probably in the insurrection, maybe directly at his hands, he murdered someone, at least one. Luke actually makes that point twice, and he makes it very, very clear. Look at verse 18 in chapter 23. It says, "But they all cried out together, 'Away with this man, Jesus, and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder.'" And then look down with me at verse 25. Luke says the exact same thing again. "He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will." How guilty must a person be to preference, to want back as a part of your tribe a murderer? Person who stirred up a riot where people died, likely people died at his hand. How guilty must you be? How dirty must you feel by sin when given the choice to have an innocent person given back to you, or somebody so obviously guilty that seething mad with spit coming out of your mouth, you say, "Give us the guilty person back. Crucify the innocent one." Pilate would go on and declare Jesus innocent 3 more times before the Jewish leaders just keep backing him up, and he eventually pronounces or sentences Jesus to death. This is 20 through 25. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. What's our biggest problem? It is our guilt. We are guilty. It says in Romans chapter 3 that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Luke is making it very clear. Everybody in this narrative is guilty. There's only one innocent person. But this isn't just an ancient story. This is our story. This is our narrative. God, by his power, by his providence, by the work of the Spirit of God, has preserved for us these holy scriptures that we may read them, not just to find accurate, true historical claims, but so that we can go to the text, we can read the story, and we can find ourselves in the narrative. You and I are guilty. We are guilty before a holy God. It doesn't matter what your sins are compared to my sins. It doesn't even matter if we really measure them up and stack them out and compare them to one another. You and I, before a holy God, an innocent, righteous, holy God, we are guilty. That's our biggest problem. Our guilt, our sin has created a rift between us and our Creator. It has created multiple rifts between you and me, between us as people. It has fractured our relationship to His creation. It has fractured our view of self and our relationship to ourselves. The problem can all be traced back to we are guilty before a holy God. Now, I mentioned at the very start that we oftentimes don't see this. I'm not saying that we can't articulate this. I just did articulate this. You can articulate this. Many of you can walk somebody through the gospel. Many of you can quote and share with others that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. I'm not saying we can't articulate that guilt is our biggest problem. What I'm suggesting is there's something about the way we think. There's something about how our minds are wired, and we have largely been trained to think, and we have thought this way, and we've trained ourselves to think that seeing our biggest problem as guilt before a holy God becomes a really difficult thing for us to do if we do it. What makes it so hard to see and accept that we're guilty, and that's our problem, and that our guilt weighs on our soul like 1,000 bricks, is our focus as people on self-making, on individuality, on our rights as people to self-determine who we want to be, and then go out and be it. Now, this self-making, this self-determination, this freedom we think we have to decide for ourselves everything from what is good and what is bad, what is moral, what is not moral. We could trace that all the way back to Adam and Eve in some respects, obviously. We could spend a lot of time, we could trace it back to the Enlightenment and many of the Enlightenment thinkers and how they contributed to this idea that man, apart from God, can choose his life and flourish and find his own path. We don't need God anymore. It's the idea that largely came out of the Enlightenment. I've been thinking a lot lately, just with the writing project that I'm working on. I've been thinking a lot lately about us specifically today in this society with the cultural shift that began in the late 60s and the early 70s. I was born right in the middle of that. That was at the time in which young people from across the nation came together and became like hundreds, if not thousands, of different student movements that began to speak out on all sorts of issues, everything from legalizing drugs to the environment, to free speech, to racism, to sexism, equal rights for the gay community. I mean, numerous issues that people came together to speak on and protest. I'm not getting into any of those issues this morning. They're complicated and they're very, very different. If there is a single theme to them, however, if there's a way to reduce down kind of the radical shift in thinking that began in the late 60s and into the 70s that I would say we live even more in today, it's this idea that every single human being has the right to self-determine, to decide who they want to be, what makes them worthy, and then to go out and to speak their truth and to live their life and to demand that society takes it all as valid and equally good and true and beautiful. And this really was kind of the product that largely began in our society in the late 60s and the early 70s. Every person is sovereign over their own lives. As sovereign, then, every single person must self-actualize. They must self-determine. They must constantly improve the invention of himself or herself. Determine the path forward to life and success and human flourishing. If you're sovereign of your own life, you have to do all of that, make all the right decisions, carry it out perfectly, and that became that's your path toward living a fulfilled, happy human existence. This idea is stronger today than it was in the 60s and 70s. We are our own sovereign. I will say this, though. There's a lot of pressure on being your own sovereign. It's a lot of work. You better do it really, really well. Like, make the right determinations about where life is found and then get out there and do it really, really, really well. There's a lot of pressure if you're going to be your own sovereign. And pressure because we all fail. We all mess up. There's nobody in the world that I fail to measure up to, that I disappoint more than I disappoint myself with the choices I make and with how I live my life. There's a lot of pressure if you're going to be your own sovereign. I think failing as our own sovereigns is oftentimes the cause of our blues. It's interesting. I'm working my way through a psychological book, Christian psychological book. Sounds really exciting, doesn't it? And the author, just this last week, I read, the author makes this statement that in 1970, which is right in the middle, it's like months before I was born, in 1970, depression was the most widespread illness in the world. And there's numbers and records that back that statement up. How does all this talk of self-determination, self-actualization, of us in our mind, right, kind of thinking I'm sovereign of my own life, I get to make my own choices, I get to be who I want to be, I get to love who I want to love. I can determine my own gender. How does this discussion of self-determination and the individual project, how does that help us see that we have a hard time recognizing the fact that our biggest problem is guilt? It's because we're so entrenched in this mindset of self-actualization and sovereignty that when we fail, when we feel bad, as we all do, a lot of the time, when our consciences are just hammering on us, we don't quickly say, it's guilt. I've got a guilt problem. I need to deal with my guilt. Instead, we tend to say, I need to improve myself. I need to choose a better path for my life. I need to be more authentic with who I must really be, but I don't know yet. But if I was more authentic and I knew myself better and I lived it out more genuinely, I would surely be more happy. So I need to think more, I need to make better decisions, I need to try harder, work better. Because then I won't feel blue, then I'll feel good about myself. When we think of ourselves as our own sovereigns, right? We don't think in terms of guilt, in terms of violating moral codes or blazing past God's created order. We don't think in those categories. We think in terms of individual achievement, self-actualization, performance, effort. We miss the problem because we're looking for the wrong thing. We're like on an interstate, and all the traffic's going this way. We're going this way. And we've got something screaming at us. You're going the wrong way. You're not viewing the problem right. This isn't a matter of you working harder to be better and figure out more truly who you are so you can go out and live your best version of your truth. This is a matter of you being made in the image of God and having eternity designed, stamped on your heart and your mind, reminding you that there is holiness, there is a truly innocent person that you fall short of. Christianity isn't all that complicated. The gospel isn't all that complicated. It's just a really specific idea. You and I are guilty before God because of our sins. We fall short. That produced death, and we're living in death. We will die one day, but it produces spiritual death, a death of relationship. Our relationship with God, our ability to relate in true love, in peace with one another, with creation, with ourselves. Our problem is guilt. Luke is showing it in this narrative, and he's inviting us into this. He's saying, I invite you to see that you have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We may think we're innocent. We may think we're good. We may think we're better than others and spend most of our time finding those others that we can feel better about ourselves. But we are guilty. And we have to deal with that guilt. That's not even the best way to say it. The best way to say it is whether we want to deal with that guilt or not, the guilt that is us will be dealt with one day by our perfect and holy and innocent and righteous Creator who will one day judge each one of us. He doesn't miss anything. He sees everything. That's our problem. If we recognize that, as Peter did, you remember that moment we just talked about it where Jesus knew Peter was guilty. He knew he would be guilty. But Peter denies Jesus, and in a glance, Peter's like, oh, I now see I'm guilty. Remember what Peter did? It says he wept bitterly. If you see your guilt and you weep bitterly over it, I'm telling you, you're ready to understand the gospel. The gospel is a gift. It's a solution. It's a person. It's the only truly innocent, righteous, holy person that's ever walked this earth. The gospel is the message that Jesus, the only innocent person, went to the cross. He took our guilt. He took it upon himself. He died for it. He paid for it. He satisfied the justice and the wrath of God with his own life. So that if you and I, guilty people, will look at the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus and say, I could never do that for myself. I'm too guilty. But he did it for me, and I trust him. I believe him. I believe what he did for me. That alone saves me. You have the gift of the innocence of Jesus given to you. You're not merely forgiven. You are forgiven. His death paid for your sins. But you also have his life, all of the ways, every moment of his life that he chose as a human to be innocent, to honor his Father and walk in righteousness. His life then becomes credited to your account. God sees you, but he sees you with the righteousness of his Son. That's the gospel. Doesn't make sense, though, if we don't see our guilt. I just say that to get to the place where, again, this morning, I invite you, if you have not placed your faith in Jesus and put your trust in him, in his death, to satisfy the wrath of God toward your guilt, I invite you to do that. It's the only solution. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for not only your cross, not only your death, but for living every moment, making every single choice that you did to be holy and to honor your Father and to be what God, you as our Father, created us to be. And that is why we trust you, Jesus. That is why we worship you and you alone. Amen.